I'd like to welcome up the people who will be speaking tonight that you've come to see. Our first presenter, on the affirming side, an associate professor of biology at the Franciscan University of Steubenville. Please join me in welcoming, snaps, or please no applause, Dr. Doroski. Joining Dr. Doroski, we have a senior at Franciscan University majoring in biology and theology. Please welcome in the same fashion Ms. Marguerite Stonier.
Here, here! Here, here. John Rankin.
On the opposing side, we have a professor of theology at the Franciscan University of Steubenville. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Birksma.
Here, here! Here, here!
And finally, joining Dr. Bergsma, we have a junior majoring in theology and philosophy here at Franciscan, Mr. Amadeo de Prague.
Here! Here!
Thank you for observing the appropriate etiquette. We ask you to keep that throughout the night, affirming by snapping and stomping your feet. If you have disagreement, yes, and keep that to a minimum. No applause for the decorum. We appreciate it. Really, get involved with the debate. Snap. So stomp your feet. Don't applaud. Hiss if you think it's necessary.
Here, here.
All that being said, I'd like you to welcome me in a very warm manner, many snaps as you can. Chairman for tonight, Vice President of the Warehouse Society, Mr. Alex Denley.
Yeah!
Please stand for the opening prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven,
hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
Saint Michael the Archangel,
defend us in battle, be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all evil spirits who prowl about the world seeking the ruin of souls. Amen.
our patron St. Thomas Aquinas.
Pray for us.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you all for coming tonight. The motion we have before us today: this House believes that Darwinian evolution is the best explanation for the diversification of life on Earth. Remember, you can either affirm the motion or oppose the motion. Is Darwinian evolution the best explanation for the diversification of life on Earth? With that, I would like to welcome Dr. Doroski for his first speech, 6 minutes.
Yeah! Here!
Thank you. Okay, thank you. I just want to start out just by saying I've been kind of undecided actually on this kind of for a long time. If you look at your three main camps, you got Darwinists, intelligent design advocates, and you got your creationists. And honestly, I respect arguments on all different sides. I think that there are intelligent arguments in all of them.
Okay, so I think there are intelligent arguments for all of them. That being said, I also think that there are flaws with all of these. And in all of these different camps, I don't think that any single one is 100% correct. So let me start off with that. That being said, though, I am going to argue here for why Darwinian evolution is the best explanation. Now, in order to understand this, first we have to understand what Darwinian evolution is. Darwinian evolution is defined as evolution through natural selection. So you have these different populations, these different groups that are competing against each other, and some are more fit than others, they reproduce more, and then the population changes and becomes more like them. Now, in order to have this, you need three different things. One, variation in traits. Two, inheritance. And then three, you need differences in the amount of reproduction. No more, no less. That is what Darwinian evolution, strictly speaking, is. So with that out of the way, I want to talk about one other thing. The fact that this has no problems with the Catholic faith. So, in fact, let me put it this way. If you want to be a faithful Catholic, you have to be creationist to some extent. You have to believe in a creator. If you want to be a faithful Catholic, you have to be an intelligent design advocate to some extent. You have to believe in an intelligent designer. If you don't believe those things, you're a heretic. That being said, the Catholic Church also seems to some kind of even affirm Darwinian evolution, although you don't strictly have to believe in it. For instance, Pope Benedict, well, let's start with John Paul II. John Paul II, in his address to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, he's actually said that we can recognize in evolution that the evidence is such that it's more than just a hypothesis. All right. He's also said that the form of our bodies, the material form, can actually have come about through an evolutionary process through previous beings, although our soul could not come about. So he acknowledges, yes, we could come about through an evolutionary process, at least the material parts. Pope Benedict XVI, what he said that if we're talking about evolution and creationism, these are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they're complementary. He's also said that evolution neither proves nor disproves the Catholic faith. What it does is it challenges the faith to a deeper understanding of itself. So let me ask you this, think about this. Do you want to understand the faith more deeply? If you do, then what I'm proposing and what Pope Benedict XVI, who's pretty good, is proposing, is that you should think a little bit and then really struggle with what Darwinian evolution means. Now, okay, so we can see Darwinian evolution, no problems with the Catholic faith, very consistent, at least according to two popes. And if anything, it actually kind of looks to me supported and even almost assumed that it's kind of happening. So then, what's the evidence that it actually is creating these diversification of species? The basic case is this: Darwinian evolution is a mechanism that we've actually seen happen in multiple cases before and plausibly explains diversification of species because it's already shown diversification of species, and any other mechanism doesn't explain as much. So let's start with this. Whether you're an intelligence design camp, creationist, or Darwinian evolution, one thing I think that everyone agrees on is that some amount of Darwinian evolution has occurred. For instance, in bacterial species, if you expose them to antibiotics, the population changes. And that is Darwinian evolution. Everyone agrees with that. Not only so, that is Darwinian evolution at a single cellular scale. You can also get this at a multicellular scale. So, for instance, we see this with the creation of different dog breeds, with new types of corn and wheat, and also with development of the breeding of chickens and cows that we have, for instance. So notice Darwinian evolution can happen not only at a single cellular level, but also multicellular level. And I want to note, too, these multicellular examples are all examples where humans have actually taken a part, where there's this intelligence that's actually designed these animals to move in that type of direction. So notice that there's no actually conflict between an intelligent designer and Darwinian evolution. You can actually have both of them happening at the same time. In fact, this is in the evolutionary textbooks, and it's called artificial selection. Now, it might be confusing how you can have this. It makes a lot more sense if you think of Aristotle's four causes: formal, final, material, and efficient. Darwinian evolution is a mechanism, so it's an efficient cause. What that means is that in order to refute it, you have to have another efficient cause. If you try to refute an efficient cause with a formal cause, that doesn't make sense. All right, can you have formal causes and efficient causes together? Yes, you can. You can have intelligences and natural selection at the same time. So that's not a problem. So in order to refute Darwinian evolution, we have to have another efficient cause to refute it. So are there such things? Well, there are other theories of efficient causes that might work, like Lynn Margulis's endosymbiosis theory, where one cell eats another cell, and that causes this kind of evolutionary change. The problem is that we know that Darwinian evolution has occurred at a single cellular and a multicellular level and has led to diversification as at least of some species, whereas all the other theories, including endosymbiosis theory, we've never seen it directly occur. We only theorize and believe it's occurred, but we've never seen it happen directly. So we're asking, what's the best explanation for the diversification of species, and we're looking at Darwinian evolution as our starting point. We need another efficient cause, and there's no other efficient cause that explains this as well as Darwinian evolution. I have 3 seconds. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Birks. Now I'd like to welcome up Dr. John Birks to the floor for a 6-minute speech.
Thank you. How many here have had a biology course in your life? Okay. How many here are comfortable explaining what the Cambrian Explosion is? We see hands. Real high. If you feel comfortable what the Cambrian Explosion is. How interesting that so many of you don't know about this, even though it's so well documented. Okay, so my position, well, there's a sociological reason for that. But anyway, it's not your guys' fault that you haven't been exposed to it in biology class. There's a reason why your teachers didn't expose you to it. Okay, so my position is I agree with Darwin against Darwinism. Charles Darwin agreed in his major work on the origin of species that a major objection to his theory was the fossil record, because the fossil record in Darwin's time did not support the ideas of gradualism. Basically, the transitional forms and the transitional fossils that would be expected if Darwinism were true weren't there. In particular, Darwin was aware of what's called the Cambrian Explosion, the fact that roughly 535 million, 540 million years ago, you have a sudden explosion or proliferation of virtually all the known phyla of macroscopic metazoans, which is basically multicelled animals that you can see. All the phyla show up at one point in the geological record. There's no transition, there's no ancestors, etc. And Darwin admitted that the Cambrian explosion was a major argument against his theory. In the fossil record, if Darwinism was true. If Darwinism was true, we should look in the fossil record and we go way back, we should just see one species. And then over millions of years, we should see a diversification of species. And then more millions of years, we should see genuses or genre appearing. And then more millions of years, we should see different clans or families diverging, and then orders. And ultimately, after a long period of time, the animals that you see in the fossil record should be so different from one another that they would be classified what we call different phyla. A phyla is a group of animals that share the same body plan, like chordates that have a backbone, okay, or sponges that have a permeable body that filters out things from the water. So that's what you should see. Now, what do we actually see in the fossil record? Well, we see bacteria for millions and millions of years and basically nothing else, bacteria and archaea. Then as you approach around 540 million years, there's a brief flash of what we call the Ediacaran biota, which are these strange animals that really nobody knows what they are. They don't look like anything living today, don't look like they're the ancestors of anything. They flash and then go out. And then about 540, 535 million years ago, depending on who you're reading, we get all the phyla, that is almost all 36 major body plans of animals that you can see suddenly appear in the fossil record at once. That's called the Cambrian Explosion. That's the biggest example of a phenomenon of the fossil record, that things suddenly appear, they stay the same, that's called stasis, and then they go extinct or they live to the present. That's what you see in the fossil record. You don't see transitional fossils, you don't see gradualism, and I have pages and pages of quotes from professional paleontologists that aren't Christians and aren't intelligent design people at all. Just admit, like Stephen Jay Gould, the Harvard's top paleontologist for about 20 years, he said that the absence of transitional forms in the fossil record is the trade secret of paleontologists. They all know it, but they don't communicate it to the public, and that's why I'm saying it doesn't really surprise me that so many of you have not heard of this, because it's kind of kept within closed doors within the paleontological society. So since Darwin's time, we've found hundreds of millions of fossils of 250,000 species. Our museums are full of them. We have a much, much higher resolution picture of the fossil record than when Darwin was alive. The picture is only clear, but the picture is not different. In fact, it's worse for Darwin than it ever was, because the transitions are so abrupt and the appearances of different animal forms are so sudden, and we can see that much more clearly than we could back in the 1800s. So I agree with Darwin against Darwinism. I agree this is a major problem for his theory, and the problem has not abated over the century and a half since his life. And I think at this point we should just say this theory does not explain the historical record of life as we know it, because that's what the fossil record is. It's not a debatable hypothetical thing, it's really a record of what has happened, and what has happened is sudden appearance and either perdurance or extinction, and that cannot be explained by Darwinian gradualism. So that's my position. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome the second speech from the affirming side, Ms. Marguerite Stonier. You'll have 6 minutes.
Hi, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Marguerite. When I was asked to come and speak here, they told me it was because I was a science student, but looking at the other guests speaking, I think it's because I'm a girl. So, take it as you will. But yes, I'm a biology and a theology double major, so you can say that I'm passionate about both God and science, so that's also another reason I think they picked me, but here we are. So I'm affirming this motion, and the first thing I wanted to talk about is the motion itself. So it talks about Darwinian evolution. Dr. Doroski did a really good job of explaining Darwinian evolution, so I'm not going to go over that again. And I want to draw your attention, it says the best explanation. So we're looking for the best explanation. It doesn't have to be 100% perfect, it doesn't have to be 100% provable, we don't have to have 100% of the evidence for that, we're looking for the best explanation here. And then for the diversification of life on Earth. So that's pretty self-explanatory. There's a lot of stuff going on Earth. You got humans, you got bunny rabbits, cats, weird little things, plants, diverse life. Alright, moving on. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is there's two types of evidence for Darwinian evolution. The first is molecular evidence. This is things that have to do with genes, stuff that's inside organisms, making them who and what they are. The second is anatomical evidence. So this is stuff on the outside you can see, such as organs, limbs, like big stuff, if you will. So the first thing I want to talk about, molecular. So this is little stuff, genes. Genes, that's the DNA that's inside every organism that creates all the proteins, everything you really need. Don't need to go into a whole biology lecture on genetics, you can take a course in it if you want. But what I wanted to point out here is that even though you have thousands of different species, from little tiny bacteria all the way up to very complex human beings, we all have a universal genetic code. So it's the same genes, the same A, D, T, C. Those aren't the right letters, forgive me, this is very nerve-wracking for me. But we have the same universal genetic code for all these organisms. Another thing I wanted to point out is that a very high percentage of these genes are the same from the little tiny bacteria all the way up to these complex human beings and everything in between, from creatures that live in the water, creatures that live on both, creatures that live on the land, and creatures that fly in the air. So, that being said, we have a lot of things in common. And so this kind of helps show that we are related, and the Darwinian evolution through natural selection has some sort of foothold because we all have the same genetic codes, we have the same blueprints, and the same thing goes on through. Okay, so the other thing is anatomical evidence. The main point here that you can use to prove Darwinian evolution, and I guess prove isn't the right word given that I just said we're just trying to find the best explanation, but alas. So it's called vestigial structures. These are structures that are found in organisms that seemingly play no role in just giving them life. So for instance, this is the appendix in human beings. Pretty sure a lot of you have had your appendix removed. And this doesn't play a role in anything except sometimes it sends you to the hospital and gets you out of school. Another structure that I really would like to point out is in whales. So whales live in the sea, they're pretty big. They don't have to walk on land, ever. They have hip bones, they have a pelvis. This pelvis is not useful unless you're walking on land. So the only explanation, and the best explanation for why they have a pelvis bone, is that at one point it was helpful for them. But whales don't walk on land. Please show me one that does. And so these vestigial structures, and those are just two examples, help us to show that the progression of natural selection, choosing certain ones, choosing certain characteristics and proteins and such that are useful and help you produce faster, better, more offspring, and those are the ones that get passed on. But vestigial structures, just for your information, are ones that eventually didn't help or hinder, and so they stuck around because nothing got rid of them. So those are two types of evidence. As Dr. Bergsma mentioned, another thing that would have been helpful for showing Darwinian evolution is the presence of a transitional or an intermediate organism. And while I personally don't have any explanation for the Cambrian Explosion piece of evidence he gave, I do have one thing that I can offer into this argument, and it's the presence of this creature that they have recently found that has all of the characteristics of a marine animal, and yet its eyes are on the top of its head. This is only helpful if you're living on land, because in the sea, your predators are coming from front, side, but not really above you. On land, all your predators are really above you because you're on the flattest part. And so the presence of this organism that has water and marine characteristics, yet the eyes on top of its head, shows that it is an intermediary structure between an organism going from the marine to the land. I also wanted to mention that microevolution has been shown in moths and in finches, which is Darwin's main organism. And so the presence of microevolution, just because we can't prove macroevolution, which is the same thing except across a wider range of time, just because we can't prove it because humans have a very short lifespan in comparison.
Please conclude.
Thank you.
And I'd like to welcome up the second speech from the opposing side, Mr. Amadeo DeCroft.
Hello, everyone. Is this working? Yes. So I have to be very honest. I honestly am a bit offended because they have provided anecdotal evidence which has nothing to do with the central contention of Darwinian evolution. The central contention of Darwinian evolution, which these people have not mentioned, is universal common descent. They have provided evidence, yes, of microevolution. And yet they say, sure, it is just macroevolution is just microevolution throughout time. But I think, I make the claim that there's a substantial difference. Universal common descent requires an increase of genetic information because you have to explain how a more complex animal derives from a less complex one. So providing evidence of a dog within a population having a greater variance, let's say, of white color instead of black color, will do nothing to prove that a more complex species arose from a simpler one. And I actually have two arguments to prove that genetic information cannot arise from the mechanism of natural selection and mutation. The first one comes from the scientist Douglas Axe. He did his postdoctoral research at Cambridge University. And studying proteins, he found how the ratio between meaningful code, that is code which encodes for proteins which fold, and non-meaningful code is extremely low. What does that mean? It means that, for example, for a protein of 150 amino acids, we have just a very strict selection of sequences of nucleotides which will allow a protein to fold. This creates a great problem for evolution because more complex structures are more complex because they require proteins, which are the building blocks of life. And if you have a narrow span, a narrow selection of code to find through mutations amongst a great variety of non-meaningful code, it is going to be very hard to get that code. And I think this can be shown, for example, look at the locks in your mailroom, right? It's hard to find the code, even when you have the code, it's kind of fine to open it, right? And why is it so? It is so because you will only have one combination that opens the door. In the same way, there is only one combination out of 10 to the 77 combinations that would allow a protein to fold. This was discovered by Douglas Axe through site-directed mutagenesis. A microbiologist probably would know what that is, and it allows you to distinguish what allows folding or not folding in proteins. And so what does this mean? It means that if a protein were to be formed, in order to cause complexification in species, you would need, sure, a creator to overcome the improbability and cause that miraculous specified mutation. But now I have a problem with this, because to say that, to overcome the probability with theism, with interventionism, you're going to have to postulate that God intervenes countless times to cause every mutation which then produces meaningful code. And this would be an extremely complex burden on a theory. To have a God which, to save the theory, intervenes for every creation, for a creation of every gene. I don't believe this is plausible. I believe in a much simpler theory in which God, through direct interventionism, creates a set of genetically rich species which, through natural processes such as de-evolution or epigenetics, in which through de-evolution or epigenetics, you allow animals to produce diversification without any need of miracles.
Yeah.
And this is very important because we have to address the central argument, which is how do we allow a simpler animal life form to give a more complex one? And they did not address this issue. They talked about antibiotics. You have the case of, for example, Lenski's bacteria. And what they found, though, is that the evolution which happened was environmentally induced by hormonal stress, which then causes the activation of a pre-existing gene. No new gene was formed, no complexification took place. You had the gene, it was latent, and it became active through various processes. And it is important to notice that evolutionism, in the context of complexification of the genetic code, is impossible statistically. I provided one statistical argument by Douglas Sachs. There's a second powerful argument by Michael Behe. In his 2007 book, The Edge of Evolution, he says how if you need for complexification 2 specified mutations in a single organism, and they have to be concomitant. Concomitant means that they have to occur in the same organism, because just one mutation won't provide any selective advantage, so it won't be preserved through natural selection. So whenever you need more than 2 concomitant specified...
1 minute.
Whenever you need more than 2 concomitant specified mutations, you incur in this statistical datum. You have the probability of that occurrence of 1 out of 10 to the 20. And this can work in large populations of bacteria, let's say, like the chloroquine resistance of the malaria bacteria P. falciparum. So within 10 years, the bacteria produced, through these 2 specified mutations, a resistance to chloroquine. But when you get, let's say, mammals, which have lower birth rate, lower mutation rate, and lower population size, you can calculate with very straightforward mathematics how that 10 to the 20th is going to apply to those populations. And Behe found that several mutations required, concomitant mutations required for the evolution of humans, would take billions and billions of years. And this destroys the evolutionary phylogenetic tree, which is basically in detail how universal descent took place. They did not address the central argument, which is universal common descent, and therefore they have failed in proving that the Darwinian evolution is the best explanation for the origin of life.
Thank you, Mr. McCraw. Thank you to both sides for very excellent, well-done speeches. We will now be taking questions for each of the presenters, beginning with Dr. Doroski. Is there a question in the House for Dr. Doroski? Mr. McDonald, you're welcome to a question.
Dr. Doroski, I was quite frankly fascinated by Amadeo's presentation. Could you perhaps give a rebuttal to try and convince me to drop my support of his last speech?
You'll have 1 minute to answer.
I think if you're fascinated, then that makes sense. Hey, I'm not offended by any of this. I think that these were very reasonable and plausible arguments for intelligence. I just think that it has nothing to do with what we're talking about today. The argument is not, was God involved or not? Was there an intelligence or not? The argument is Darwinian evolution the best explanation? And again, like I said, Darwinian evolution is an efficient cause. So if you're saying, so you could have Darwinian evolution that just happens through natural means. You could have
30
Darwinian
seconds.
evolution that happens through intelligences like humans, artificial selection. You could have supernatural Darwinian evolution where God intervenes, all right? And what he said that, okay, his theory is that you start with a lot of information and then you just have a decrease in complex information. That would be a Darwinian evolutionary process. That's a natural selection process. So, I mean, he's basically saying, he's saying there's an intelligence that you can only go from complex to less
Please
complex.
conclude.
That's not the argument, all right? Whether you can go from complex to not complex is not the argument. It's, is there a natural selection process that explains this the best?
Thank you, Dr. Doroski and Mr. McDonald for the question. We will now take a question for Dr. Bergsma. Is there a question in the House? Mr. Your last name? O'Rourke. O'Rourke. Question for Dr. Bergsma. Please be loud.
I would like to know that if evolution, or excuse me, if Darwinian evolution is not proven, what would be the explanation for vestigial organs in animals like whales and humans?
The question is on vestigial organs.
Yeah, I dispute that we have vestigial organs. And I'll take the two examples that were given. First of all, the appendix. The appendix has a function in the human body. It's been found to store good bacteria through illnesses where your natural flora get expelled through your sickness, through diarrhea, etc. And the appendix stores that good bacteria, the other good microorganisms that you need for health in a safe place, so that when you're restored to health, that's to go back and repopulate. And the pelvis on the whale actually serves as a foundation for ligaments and muscles that it needs for waggling the back end of its body. So what we have does have purposes to it.
Thank you, Dr. Bergsma. Thank you for the question, Mr. O'Rourke. We will now take a question for Ms. Stonier. Is there a question in the House? Miss Bergsma, you're on the
Hi. What is the difference between your definition of adaptation and evolution? Between adaptation and evolution? So I guess an adaptation is something that a singular organism, okay, so let's say you're in a situation and you're not doing well. You change something about your personality or something about yourself in order to better fit into that group. That's basically what an adaptation is, except on a little bit of a different level because it has to do with the organism's survival. Evolution.
30 seconds.
Evolution is actually defined as the changing of a species from one species to another, meaning that they can't actually sexually reproduce. And so an adaptation can happen within an organism or within a species, but the change in adaptation, if it makes the new organism unable to sexually reproduce with its previous self, that's evolution.
Thank you, Ms. Stonier. We will now take a question for Mr. DePraw. Is there a question in the House? The chair would like to recognize Mr. Spieldener to a question.
Mr. DePraw, Dr. Doroski essentially argued that you are indeed arguing for a altered Darwinian evolution theory. I would assume that you would disagree with this, but the argument is essentially that we don't have to have a
Please make it a question.
But this is the best one. How would you argue that your theory is not evolution and is better than Darwinian evolution?
Sure, because evolution has two contentions. One is the mechanism of random mutations and natural selection, and the other one is universal common descent. I reject universal common descent. And sure, I'm not a fixationist. All creationists accept the fact that species change. And perhaps species change to the point to which they cannot reproduce anymore with its original ancestors. But there's no increase of genetic information. So I guess there's a terminological issue here. And Darwin, I think, agreed with what I meant, because he was arguing for universal common descent. Perhaps he has a non-Darwinian theory of evolution, which maybe he wants to explain more. But yes, my theory is just direct interventionism of an originally genetically rich set of animals, which requires God to intervene less and is therefore a simpler theory. That's how it differs. And I don't assert universal common descent.
Thank you, Mr. Duprat. I'd like to express that these are excellent opening speeches. We will now be moving to the open floor period of the debate, in which the floor is open to anyone in the audience to make a speech, up to 5 minutes maximum upon recognition of the chair. We will also be having one question for these presenters. After that, we will have 3-minute speeches from Dr. Bergsma and Dr. Doroski, and then we'll move into the lightning round, which are 2-minute speeches. So if you don't want to make a full 5-minute speech, that would be the time to do it. The floor is now open. I would like to recognize Mr. Your name again? Trumpy to the floor. So you have 5 minutes for a speech.
Can you toss me a water bottle? Thank you, sir.
Hello? Yeah, there it goes. Hi, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm really going to talk about 3 things. The first one that I want to discuss is this concept of the Cambrian, the Cambrian period and punctuate equilibrium. The concept that when you're talking about Darwinian evolution, you're going to have long periods of stasis, followed by some period of upheaval that is then going to lead to a very rapid set of evolution. The second thing I want to talk about is, actual real-world examples of natural selection working and presenting new developments, new kinds of species. And then finally, I want to talk just a little bit about the general concept of the actual, resolution itself. So to start with, we need to look at the Cambrian period, and more specifically the pre-Cambrian period. So there have been a couple of great discoveries recently, specifically in the Canadian shale deposits, as well as the Qinqiang deposits in China, in which we discovered multi-celled, soft-bodied organisms that fit directly into the fossil record. So when you examine those creatures, what you discovered was that not only did many of these, the Cambrian, not only did the Cambrian period have direct ancestral links, but that it then continued onwards into the future. Now, that being said, what did confuse scientists for a while was this very rapid, onset of change from these soft-bodied, multi-celled organisms into something that is much closer to what we see today, just, birds, reptiles, things like that. And the answer for that ultimately is punctual equilibrium. And what typically happens in the fossil record is you'll see many years of stasis, in which the soft-bodied multi-celled organisms basically remain the same until there's some sort of upheaval event that requires some form of evolution. So what occurred in this specific instance was that there was some sort of mass extinction event that made it much harder to live on planet Earth, which encouraged useful adaptations, and those useful adaptations then led to this sort of burst of different kinds of life that really can be linked back through those pre-Cambrian discoveries in Canada and China. So then the second issue is actual real-world examples of adaptation. So pandas are an excellent example of this. Pandas don't have opposable thumbs. What they do have are these little nubs of bone on the side of their paws, hands, whatever you want to call it, that allow them to better grasp bamboo. Now, tracing that back along the record, pandas didn't originally have that. That was a useful adaptation that made it easier to grasp bamboo, made it easier to eat it. All we're talking about when we're talking about evolution is those sort of useful adaptations piling up. So if we're talking about macroevolution versus microevolution, right? We're really just talking about once an organism has had so many adaptations that it would no longer be able to reproduce with its previous iteration, 1,000 years ago. At that point, it becomes a new species and we have a new diverse, subset. Final point I want to make is that we're really just looking for the best way in which we can describe how things are going on in our world right now. So it's great that we have these very hard questions on the concept of evolution, but it doesn't disprove the theory as a whole. What it does is it makes us think, right? It makes us think about how complex these issues are, and it makes us, conduct ourselves in a more admirable manner. Because it forces us to refine the theory, it forces us to be better academically. So just because there are doubts, just because there are hard questions for the theory of evolution, for Darwinian evolution in particular, it doesn't mean that it's not the best concept that we have right now to explain our natural world. Thank you.
Speakers, is there a question for the speaker? Father, your last name?
Alexander.
Father Alexander, you're welcome to a question.
And I was listening to you and some of the other speakers, it seems that a necessary component is this idea to be able to find at some point one species that somehow reaches a point through evolution that it can no longer reproduce with the previous species.
Yeah.
Right, but that has to take so much time, it would seem, that we could never produce evidence of this actually existing. And so it seems to be logically an impossible argument to make. And when we look at those artificial ways in which we...
Please formulate a question.
Sorry. Can you give me any example in which we actually see this demonstrated in a way that, like, you have another species being reproduced so that they can't reproduce, but can also reproduce with themselves?
I don't have any particular examples memorized at the moment. What I can tell you is my understanding of how that works conceptually, which is that we do have examples of of one species being separated into two populations by some sort of physical barrier or something else, and that those two species then evolve independently, and when they come back into contact with one another, they are no longer able to reproduce across those lines. So I don't have a specific example, but that's how we're able to prove it historically.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. As the debate evolves, I would like to make an instance of intervention and encourage more participation by the audience regarding snapping if you approve something or nixing if you disapprove. Thank you very much. We will now take another open floor speech. I'd like to recognize Mr. Hamar to the floor.
Here, here. Amen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I would just like to make a couple observations and then a couple points about how we prefer one explanation to another that we can maybe use to situate the debate and discussion. First, a point about science. Science, as we all know, is an inherently empirical project. It's based on observation. And science is so powerful and so meaningful because it has a certain infallibility. If I drop a pen, I see it actually falls, and no one can really disagree. So science has a certain infallibility because of its empirical nature. What this means is that things that we haven't observed, even things that are based upon scientific observations and argued from scientific observations, don't have the same sort of scientific infallibility that we're used to when we're talking about science. A conclusion that something is true because of, in the past, that no one's seen, because of something we've seen today,
could be reasonable, but it might not certainly be true. We can say we see certain processes going on today. It's reasonable to assume they always have, but it doesn't mean that they actually always have. I mean, you could imagine the tribe lived by the river, and every generation had seen the river flowing by, and that means there's always been a river, but maybe there wasn't, thousands and thousands of years ago. The point is, non-observed things don't have this sort of strict infallibility that we generally expect themselves.
Here, here.
Okay, that's one. The next point I want to make is on how we prefer one theory to another on sort of a theoretical level. And I'd like to propose three characteristics. The first is explanatory power. That's to answer the question we're asking. Second, simplicity. If two theories explain the same amount, but one's simpler, theoretically we should prefer the simpler explanation. That's called Occam's razor. And third, obviously, truth, right? You can verify it. If it's true, it's a better theory than false theory. Right? Nothing new here. So, the motion says that Darwinian explanation is the best explanation for life. And we're so used, reading in our textbooks that this is certainly what happened. It's kind of hard to imagine anything else. So I want to propose another explanation for the diversity of life we've seen. And this is the classical Catholic idea of the great chain of being. In Catholic philosophy, understanding that reality, being, has certain levels of perfection, or certain levels of existence, such that a living thing is more perfect than a non-living thing. A human that is intellectual is more perfect than an ape. An angel, purely spiritual and incorruptible, is more perfect than a human. There's a certain gradation. The great chain of being says that every step of this gradation is filled all the way up. So we see non-organic matter, we see plants, we see animals, we see more complex animals like apes versus, say, single-cellular organisms, humans, and then angels. The great chain of being, a big part of the evidence for evolution is the idea that we see these things and they look kind of similar, and this one looks more primitive than this one. So that must mean this came from that. Because they look similar, but one's a bit older and more primitive. And again, that's rational, right? Maybe that's true, but it's not the only explanation. The great chain of being explains this just as well. So when it comes to evaluating these two theories, say, on the 3 points that I brought up, I think explanatory power is about the same, right? We can explain diversity of life with evolution or with the great chain of being. Simplicity, it tends to be a thorny thing, and there's lots of debate, so I'm not going to get into it. And then we have the truth of it. We think evolution is true based on certain things we observe today, like selection within a species and genetic diversity, mutations, and things like this. And we say because we observe this today, it's reasonable to think this has always happened in the past, and that explains all. And again, it's reasonable. But it lacks the proper infallibility that, properly speaking, scientific observation has. Now, on the other hand, we have the Word of God, which says that God created everything, just snap of his fingers and literal. And we can say, well, we don't have to understand it literally. And that's true. The Catholic Church instructs us that we're to interpret Scripture in the strict, literal sense, except when reason or necessity demands. Now, evolution not being certain, being based on the assumption that things have always gone on the same as they are in the past, the same in the past as they are now, and lacking the proper infallibility of science and having no one to observe it, doesn't have certainty. It's a reasonable thought, but it's not certainly true. Now, we have certain truth. We believe theology and the authority of truth itself who reveals it to us, and his church, which instructs us that we're to interpret it literally. We have certainty coming from revelation on God's own authority that creation operated in the way that he said it did. We have less than certainty on the evolutionary side. So I would say it's more reasonable to believe creation than evolution.
Here, here! I love you, Zach!
Is there a question in the House for Mr. Neymar?
There you go. Oh, this is the question section.
Miss, you're welcome to the question.
Why can't you believe the both?
Great. So, when I said creation versus evolution at the end, it's kind of unfortunate that the question spent on this, but I meant creation in the sense of direct, instantaneous, unmediated, causal action by God, as contradistinguished from sort of Darwinian evolution and development, right? So, I mean, that's the difference, and I think you can't believe both of those because those both are talking about the mechanism. But the argument that I developed, 30 seconds, to my mind, is in support of that sort of literal instantaneous creation based on the sort of biblical interpretation principles that the church has laid down of understanding the literal sense unless we can't, right? And because evolution doesn't bring certainty the way that faith does, then it's not that we can't believe it because we're not certain evolution's true. So it's not that we cannot believe creation is literally true. And so according to the interpretation or some principles of the church, we should believe creation. Thank you, Mr. Hamar. We'll now take another open floor speech. The chair would like to recognize Dr. McKenna to the floor.
You can see Dory.
Right.
So, speaking of the Cambrian Explosion, I like to tell the students in survey biology that I have a piano at home. It has the same keys as everyone else's piano. It can play very different music, depending upon how the keys are played. And this is what I think that we can look to our understanding of how we can make such diverse outcomes from the same genetic material. By how we actually play the genes that these organisms, same or different, have, and how different they can become if you play the genes differently. And some examples of that you could see in your own body, which is extraordinary. I mean, you have, every cell in your body has the exact same DNA, the exact same genes, but the cells in your body are very dramatically different from one another. A muscle cell looks radically different than does a neuron, than does an epithelial cell. And so these are the same DNA, same genes, but turned on in different ways to get radically different outcomes. And this starts to allow us to explain how we can see these dramatic different patterns in organisms that then would no longer reproduce together if they change that dramatically. Now, what are some common examples of this? I love metamorphosis. When you look at a larvae, a caterpillar is very, very different from a butterfly. I think that we all can concede that. They share the exact same DNA. They came from the exact same cells. But the genes that were expressed were very different. And we got very, very different outcomes. And a butterfly is not going to interact with a caterpillar. They have fundamentally become different things in a very, very short period of time, just by differential gene expression. And this starts to lay credence to changes that can happen very rapidly. Combined with, now that's not classic neo-Darwinism, but epigenetics can suggest also that we have very rapid changes, which is this idea of, again, changing gene expression, but not through mutation, but rather through preventing genes from expressing. These are all ways that we can get dramatically different effects that would lead to rapid speciation. And the last thing that I would suggest was, we certainly can't throw gradualism out, because there are clear examples of gradualism in nature. So I'm an ocular immunologist, and the eye is a clear example of gradualism in a record that you can follow. You start with an animal that has a light spot that can sense, is there light or is there not light? And then that light spot becomes cupped so that we can have an orientation. Did the light come from here? Did the light come from there? And then that cupping continues to occur, and then we can better focus light onto that light spot through a lens and a cornea, and we get the evolution of the camera eye that Darwin conceded if we could not show that transition, that his theory would be null and void. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McKenna. Is there a question in the House for Dr. McKenna? Question from Mr. DePraw.
Yeah. How do you think epigenetics, with the explanation of a pre-existing gene being activated, give support to the idea that new genes are formed over time? Because, how do you think that supports that?
I think what none of the speakers have brought to light is that the genome has duplicated in our history. So there is a duplication of the entire genome, and this allows for chances to be taken where you don't have to compromise fitness because you have one genome that you've duplicated and you can vary and make changes to. So that's how I
30 seconds.
See that. And it seems that we get to this idea that new genes are becoming available, but with duplication of the genome, we could have mutations to existing genes, and because all these proteins are built from domains of genes, then you could create novel patterns by slight mutations in existing genes. You don't have to create a new protein de novo, just modify what you have slightly.
Thank you, Dr. McKenna. Thank you. The chair will now recognize another speech. Chair would like to recognize Miss. You're welcome to a speech. You'll have 5 minutes.
Right, it's been a while since I've done this. So I actually wanted to start by evening out the field a little bit because it feels like those people who haven't taken a course that covers evolution in any detail are a little bit at a disadvantage here. So real quick, Darwinian evolution, how does it work, right? One of the things that it doesn't do is it's not need-based. Evolution does not have, you can't take a species and put it in a new environment and then it will evolve in adaptation in the way that these evolve. These differences, these changes that we're talking about, they arise randomly, and then based off of a change in the environment, it may or may not move on to reproduce and survive. So if I take a rabbit and I put it in the ocean, it's not going to grow gills. But for some strange reason, a rabbit happened to evolve gills, and then the ocean rose. That rabbit would survive, and the others wouldn't. Not that would ever happen. So we're not looking at need-based. We're looking at changes that are happening little by little. And as Dr. McKenna said, it's gene expression or it's an actual mutation. What the opposing side either didn't mention or didn't bring into context at all is that when you have changes in genes, the genetic code, one change in letter doesn't necessarily mean everything's void. It's not that one out of millions and millions of different codes is the only way you can get this protein. Codons, these 3 sequences of genetic code, some of them can code for, multiple of them can code for the same amino acid, the same building blocks of these proteins. And so you can get the same proteins with different codes. And then when we look at fossils, fossils are just the hard tissue part of the animal. You can't keep soft tissue in fossils. And so a lot of these structures in these animals, aren't kept. And then what we're able to see also through the fossil record and the living record, animals that still exist, is a gradual change. There's an animal called a coelacanth. it was thought to be extinct. It's a type of bony fish. It basically has like an armor, some sort of armor on its head. And it has a sort of elongated fin that may or may not have become, in later years, as evolution continued, may or may not have become limbs that could support a body in gravity, limbs that could support an animal that lived on land. And we thought it was an extinct animal. It was in the fossil records from millions of years ago. And then some random fish market in, I think, Thailand showed up with it. Just caught it in a net. Was from the deeper parts of that particular ocean. And scientists were shocked. This thing that they were calling a fossil still existed. And we have examples of animals that we're pretty sure have come from this animal because they're so similar. And yet it still exists. So some of them changed. Some of them changed and adapted to a new habitat. And that new habitat was better for them, and so they changed. But some of them stayed the same. And so here we have examples of why you need to have a change in environment, you need to have a change in habitat in order for any sort of change to happen. And if there isn't, if it's fine where it is, if there's nothing wrong with the structure that it has, it will stay the same. So the Cambrian Explosion. The Cambrian Explosion, if you don't have a change in the habitat that the animal's in, why would it change? Why would an animal with a new structure be any better off than the old one if the old one works? But if it does change, if there's an event, as was said earlier, if there's an event that does change it, then diversification of species makes sense. And so I would argue that there's no reason not to believe Darwinian evolution, at least as a mechanism. It makes sense. And if we can't disprove it, why would we throw it out when there's so much more we could learn from it?
After the question, we'll be moving into the lightning round. And before that, Dr. Doroski will have 3 minutes to speak. And then Dr. Birks will have 3 minutes. And then we'll move into the lightning round, in which there will be 2-minute speeches, so we'll be able to have a lot more speakers. Is there a question in the House for the speaker? Mr.
Feldman.
You're welcome to a question.
So you were talking...
Please use the mic. Thank you.
Sorry.
Yep.
So you were talking about the Cambrian Explosion and the fossil record, and fossil record only recording soft tissue. How then do you explain the Cambrian Explosion in light of fossil discoveries such as invertebrate marine animals such as octopi, jellyfish, even at the tops of the Himalayas, as well as other fossils such as polystrate fossils, where you have trees or whales that cross multiple geological strata that, according to some scientists, should have been laid down over millions and millions of years?
So, from what I understand, you're asking why we find these structures that seem to be primitive in either later ones or seem to be derived in earlier. Is that what you're asking?
No, I'm saying, how is it that we can find fossilized soft tissue creatures that don't have bones?
Yeah. So that's just a different mechanism, of fossilization. That's just, from what I understand, not a geologist, I'm going to be that. But from how I understand it, that's just where they're fossilized, basically. If you have fossilification happening in a substance which preserves the soft
30
tissue
seconds.
imprint, you'll have it, but you won't have the soft tissue itself. Yeah? So the skeletal structure will stay in most pressurized fossilification, but the imprint of the soft tissue can happen in certain substances, so it depends on the substance in which it's fossilized, from what I understand.
Thank you very much. I would now like to welcome up Dr. Doroski for a 3-minute speech, and followed by Dr. Bergsma for a 3-minute speech. And then we will be moving into the lightning round, in which speeches will be 2 minutes with no questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, a couple things I want to point out again.
Sorry, Dr. Doroski, no notes for you.
Oh, okay.
Thank you very much.
Should I write this note down now? Okay, that's all right. Okay, I just want to point out again, I'm with Pope Benedict XVI. I don't know how many the rest of you are, but I just like to think that evolution and these other things don't really conflict with each other. I also want to make some quick notes. So this Cambrian explosion was brought up to me one time. So I was talking to somebody who about this, and I said, what about the Cambrian explosion? And what they said to me is, what they pointed out to me is that around the time of the Cambrian explosion, there was a lot of plants that were developing, and plants undergo photosynthesis, which creates a lot of oxygen. Oxygen is a very reactive chemical, and when you have a lot of reactive chemicals, that leads to more mutations, which could explain the explosion of species. Now, I will tell you, I haven't looked into that more deeply than that, but I found it pretty plausible myself. So, there's some ignorance in my part there, but I found that fairly plausible. Also, there was, the other point that was being made. Oh well, I forgot it because I was gonna get my notes because I thought I still like to take notes during this, and I figured I could look at my notes I was taking. All right, so the other thing that I'll note is again, so what is Darwinian evolution? It's evolution through natural selection. That is the dictionary definition. It's not written on that poster, but in our emails together, we did. I thought we agreed on that's what it is. And then if you look at the textbook definition of what you need for natural selection, we did again 3 things: variation in traits, inheritance, and variations in reproduction. All right. Now that does not say whether you can. It doesn't. That's kind of agnostic on whether there's greater increases in complexity or decreases in complexity. So even if you say that all life started out, or even God had certain numbers of creations, and then everything just devolved, all right, at that time. That's still a natural selection process, all right, because you still have those 3 things. So, I'm with you, that could, I guess I could go either way on whether more complexity or less complexity could occur, but it really doesn't get to the question, all right? That's what I say. Okay, so one other real good argument that I thought that was brought up, and I'm trying to remember what it was. New species. Oh, someone was asking about new species. So I want to make 2 points on that. There are examples actually of new species that are coming back. So one example, I didn't look at my notes even for this. One example is that, so with dog breeds, most of them aren't thought to be all the same species, but there are dogs that can't interbreed, so it does look like you kind of have new species there. There also were some plants that were brought from Europe, 2 different plant species that could interbreed and then create a hybrid species that was sterile. And then what we found over time is that we checked those species again, and we found this 3rd new species that was actually the interbreeding of the 2, where actually the DNA code had duplicated again, and this new species could now interbreed with itself, but it couldn't interbreed with any of the parent. It was basically sterile with the parent species, but not sterile within itself. So it does look like we've had examples of kind of this new species creation at a multicellular level, at least as far as I can see. Thank you.
Will you take is there a question in the house for Dr. Doroski? We'll be taking 1 question. Sure, I'd like to recognize Dr. Harwood for a question. Hopefully you will have no notes for this question.
So I understand that you're defining evolution in accordance with the terms set by the debate, but it seems that you're excluding as a necessary part of Darwinian evolution mutation as a source of new genetic information. Is that in fact your position? And isn't that a little bizarre in that it contradicts the neo-Darwinist position?
No, so when this debate was first set up, I looked up, so when I had to teach, when I said, okay, I'm going to have to teach evolution to my students this semester, one thing I said is, I got to look up what my terms are. So I went Darwinian evolution, I put it in the dictionary. And if you look it up, wherever it says, it always says evolution through means of natural selection. That's what the textbooks say. That put in dictionary.com. Look at your phone right now. That's what it's going to say. So that's what I'm using. Now, you used the term neo-Darwinism, and I specifically, didn't use the term neo-Darwinism because neo-Darwinism is Darwinistic evolution plus our understanding of genetics.
30 seconds.
So it doesn't include things like epigenetic changes, although Darwinian evolution would include epigenetic changes, but neo-Darwinism would not. All right. So in a certain sense, Darwinism is kind of a more broad thing, and that's why I defined exactly what was at the beginning. That's why I suppose we discussed it in our emails to some extent, and then that's why I argued the way that I argued.
Thank you, Dr. Chair would now like to recognize Dr. Bergsma for a 3-minute speech.
I think our debate is losing focus because the form of evolution that's being advanced by the positive side is so amorphous it's hard to argue against it. Like, what would it not include? Because the definition that's being used for Darwinian evolution is not the definition that's usually employed in the academy. Neo-Darwinism holds to random mutation is acted upon by natural selection. And now randomness is the key thing, because there's a sociological and philosophical agenda here that has to be random. We have to get rid of a creator. And the scientific establishment supports, the scientific establishment does not want there to be a creator, and the scientific establishment wants to offer an alternative to the explanation for life that excludes a creator from the picture and explains everything through random processes and laws. So the real central force of, for example, neo-Darwinism is that randomness plus natural law is all you need, and you can exclude a creator from the picture. And one of the things that Ami and I are arguing against is the ability of randomness and natural law to explain the increases in genetic information that are necessary to explain the diversification of life. And that's the hard issue. Can random mutation and natural selection alone explain these things? Dr. McKenna talked about the recombination of genetic factors, and all that's true. And you can produce other animals by rearranging genomes if you're an intelligent agent. But that's not going to happen randomly. Randomly, the thing's going to die, okay? And we can demonstrate that. That's, and the other examples that have been given of evolution have actually been examples of devolution, okay, of things getting less fit. For example, dogs. All dogs come from wolves, but no dog breeds could survive in a competition against actual wolves because they're actually dog breeds that we have in our homes are less fit for the wild environment than the original parent species. That's an example of devolving or going down. You're losing genetic information there. That's the same with antibiotic resistance. Bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics are actually less fit than their parent species. They've lost some information that makes them more difficult for the antibiotic to grab or to kill, but they're not superior to their parent species of bacteria. They aren't really superbugs, and at a certain point, they get so weak that they die. So I don't feel like any of the examples that have been brought forward have really shown that randomness with natural selection can really explain the diversity of life.
Thank you, Dr. Bergsma. Please take a question. Is there a question in the House for Dr. Bergsma? Chair, I'd like to recognize Mr.
McCarthy.
Mr. McCarthy for a question.
So, Darwinianism definitely makes a political and religious or philosophical position on the source of our being and whether or not there's a creator. But Darwinian evolution, I don't think Darwinian evolution has a stance on the ensoulment of our beings. It just has a possible cause of our material form. And you brought up randomness.
Please formulate a question.
My question is, could you please define randomness? Because that term has two different implications, and I'm not sure if there was any.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, randomness. I don't believe in randomness because but randomness. Okay, let me back up. chance is not a causal agent. You know, people will say, well, there was a chance mutation. Well, no, chance never causes anything. When you say that something happened by chance, it's another way of saying, I don't know what the cause was. Mutations are actually caused by radiation, typically. So, radiant...
30 seconds.
Radiant elements strike our actual molecules in our DNA as they're reproducing and knock them out of line, and that causes an error in the code. That 99.99% of the time, that's harmful, just like randomly changing a byte in a computer program. Only rarely does it do anything helpful, and that's usually when it turns off something that you don't need at the moment. Why are you hissing? Because this is true. All right, so there is no randomness, and radiation is not going to cause an increase in genetic information.
Thank you, Dr. Bergsma. Thank you to both Dr. Doroski and Dr. Bergsma for those excellent speeches. We'll now be moving into the lightning round, in which there will be 2-minute speeches, so very rapid, along with no questions. I'd like to recognize Mr. Rankin. Please remain within charity.
Thank you. All right, so real quick question, totally off topic. Who here is pro-family? Raise your hands. Pro-family, raise your hands. Really? Why are you pro hands up? All right, great. Timmy, come on up. All right, this is my little brother, Timmy.
Well, I'll be along, Mr. Rankin, please.
All right, somebody's pro-anti-family. Okay. All righty here. All right, so.
Mr. Rankin.
Please
continue.
All right, yes, sir. Count. All right, so. In relation to Darwinian evolution, my problem here lies in this. Philosophically, the problem is that it is fundamentally based on materialism and is dependent upon it in the nature of the thing, right? Right, so development via chance is based on the fact that it's Epicurean, right, where nothing is anything but matter, it moves randomly, it turns into things, right? Form is not in the equation, right? So in relation to form biological, we'll talk this way, right? Artificial selection and breedability have both been brought up, right? Dogs are a perfect example. Artificial selection, right? You have dogs that look like rats, all right? They can't breed with rats. That's you think Chihuahua, and I know this is immoral but not, but you can artificially inseminate a Great Dane with Chihuahua and it will breed, right? Whereas you can't breed a rat with a Chihuahua. You never can. There are dogs that look more like foxes. The idea of apparent characteristics as a factor in form is not the thing. So I mean, the idea is that animals have form, right? They have nature. When you believe a Darwinian conception of reality, you remove nature from the equation, right? Like accept. Everything's pliable and movable, right? Now, I can't have a little brother here apparently because we're not pro-family, but you know, the reality is he was do some biological back and forth. I was going to philosophical ground, but how come up next, would you? Yeah, thank you. I'm done.
Here. Timmy.
I will now recognize another speech. I'd like to recognize Mr. You'll have 2 minutes for speech.
Come on, sir.
Hi, thanks for everyone coming out. So this is a subject really near and dear to my heart, and I think one of the things I was noticing as the esteemed Dr. Bergsma and Dr. Doroski were debating, and those on either side, was that not a lot of randomness was brought up earlier in the talk, maybe by Dr. Bergsma and the opposing side, but I think that randomness is only a product of our not understanding the full record of things. Like I deal with dinosaurs, so there's a lot of randomness inherent in that, but it's only because we don't understand what's going on. So going off of that randomness, there was a species called Asphaltovenator that was announced, I think it was late last year, and it had traits that were present in multiple different groups of dinosaurs that succeeded it. Now, it might seem random, like why does this early dinosaur in this group have all these traits? Well, it was present after an extinction, so it kind of grabbed hold of all those traits, and it might seem random in that individual, but once all those niches were filled, then they could kind of diversify, and those random characteristics, and as, please remind me of your last name again? DePra was saying is that there's a lot of information held in it that's divulged out, so I think the randomness can be disproven by us just not understanding what's going on currently. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Fair recognize another speech. Chair would like to recognize Ms. Bergsma to the floor. You'll have 2 minutes per speech.
Alright, hi guys. First of all, yes, I am a Bergsma, and my dad's either going to really hate me or really love me after this. Second of all, I'm a high school student, so I'm not a college student, I'm not a professional in this, but I do know what's right and what's wrong, and I do know what's stupid and what's not stupid. So I will say, I believe Mr. Curtis touched on this. I'm just going to touch on it because I don't have a lot of time, but it was about adaptation and how things build off of other things and become another thing. That's not true. Adaptation is different from evolution. They're not the same thing. When you're saying something came from a manatee and became an alligator, which is ridiculous, by the way, that's different from saying a wolf and a dingo in Australia and a wolf in Canada are the same base species in that a wolf is still a dog and a dingo is still a dog. They look alike. But a dingo lives in a desert and it has short hair and it knows how to live in a desert, and a wolf knows how to live in a cold, snowy forest. That is adaptation. And that is also evolving, and when we have house pets, such as cats, are different from mountain lions, yet they're both cats. We have domesticated cats, and that is de-evolution, in which it's becoming smaller and smaller, weaker and weaker. And same thing with dogs. When we have wolves, those are different from dogs, in that the domesticated dog is weaker than the wolf that we have in the wild right now. And that's basically all I have to say on this, because like I said, I'm not a professional. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The chair will now recognize Mr. Hahn to the floor for his
speech. All right, first off, just want to sacrifice a little bit of just the beginning of my speech really quickly. Can we hear it for these wonderful speakers? I mean, these speeches were make some noise. Let's go, let's go. Okay, that's not so crazy. No, I just wanted to take this from a slightly different angle, because I think that it's a really interesting topic. But I think when we start talking about the diversity of life, when we start talking about the diversity of life, I want to ask, what kind of life are we talking about, right? Are we talking about strict biological life? Are we talking about life, right? Life as it is, right? As you and I are alive right now, experiencing the world, right? One of the biggest things that we experience is beauty, okay? The order of creation. It's amazing. It's wonderful, right? Sunsets and rainbows happen all the time, and yet they are amazing things. There is order to this creation, and my fear with accepting such emotion as this is that we sacrifice part of the order of our creation. If we say, well, not for humans, chill out. When we say, well, not humans, okay, not humans, they've got a soul and everything, but everything else is random, okay? Everything from the butterfly to the viper. This is totally random. My fear is that we lose the poetry of creation, that we lose the music, all right, of light, that we lose the things that gives the world meaning inherently. Why? Because the creator of this world is the God of order, and not just order, a symphonic order, a harmony, one of which we get to add a voice to, something that we get to listen to and ponder. That is what I want to do.
Please conclude.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hahn.
Attaboy, Dave.
Chair will now recognize Mr. Kelman. To a speech. You have 2 minutes.
All right, real quick and on science, and we're going to get to the real meat. Okay, so we would talk about micro and macro evolution a little bit. Microevolution, small changes within a species, or a kind, species kind of ambiguous, versus macroevolution, changes from one kind of organism, like let's say a dog, that's come up a lot, into something different. So let's say a rabbit, that's also come up. We cannot observe that. It has never been observed. For example, I believe bacteria has been brought up in the past. We have experimented, I believe on E. coli for, if I remember correctly, for about 15 years. Thousands and thousands. Is this the one? Thank you. I think it's maybe over several 100,000 generations of E. coli bacteria, and it's still E. coli. No change. And if we look back in the record, we have mummified organisms from ancient Egypt, thousands and thousands of years old, still basically identical to what we see now. And this makes sense because if we look at microevolution as kind of accidental change, just go into metaphysics, and macroevolution is a substantial change, no amount of accidental change can ever make a substantial change. But really, at the root of this, the diversification, the origin of life, is not a scientific issue. In the past, it never was. It's actually a theological issue, which is why in 1878, and no one knows this, very, very few people know this, the church actually condemned Darwinism. Albeit incorrectly, but Pope Leo XIII approved a condemnation of a book by Raphael Cambrian, if I'm saying his name right, promoting a theistic, Darwinistic view of the origin and diversification of species, and it was condemned on theological, philosophical, and scientific grounds. He approved it personally, and no one knew about it until 1998. It was hidden in the Vatican archives. No one recognized it because it was just on the index, but we are still bound morally to adhere to the decisions of the index, even though the index no longer exists, according to the teaching of Pope Pius X. Please conclude. So, Darwinism is opposed to the faith, according to Pope Leo XIII.
Chair, recognize another speech. Chair, I'd like to recognize Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks, you're welcome to speak. 2 minutes speech.
Hi. So, I'd like to say something about the scientific method first. Not a brilliant scientist, but science will see some physical phenomenon, ask questions about it, and try to figure out stuff about it. You know, maybe do some experiments, blow something up in the lab. I don't know, I do that a lot. So, we see the diversification of life on Earth. And, you know, we try to explain that. And as Dr. Doroski brilliantly pointed out at the very beginning, Darwinian evolution has its issues. Just like all the theories that were brought up today. And that's a natural part of the scientific method. You don't just see something happen and have a brilliant explanation for it right away. You make a guess. You could say, okay, maybe it's because of this. You try to back up that guess with some experiments or something. And it's a very circular thing. You'll go back and modify your guess a little bit. You know, try to figure out what you're missing and what you got. So as you come up with like a guess and you try to figure things out, you know, your knowledge therein develops. And so science, that's why science changes. We don't anymore think that we live in the back of a turtle. I mean, science changes. No. The proposition says that Darwinian evolution is the best explanation. It's not the best explanation if there's a better one. Now, as Dr. Doroski said, it's got issues. Now, God made the world somehow. God made the world somehow. There's a way. As far as science can tell, maybe Darwinian evolution is the best one we have so far out of what we know and observe scientifically. But as Dr. Doroski said, from a science point of view, we still see issues with it. So maybe we'll get to a better explanation of Darwinian evolution. We might not get to the best one, but there is a better one. And if there's a better one, it's not the best one.
Thank you very much. Chair will now recognize a speech from Dr. Lee. You're welcome to the floor for 2 minutes.
I may not take 2 minutes. I wanted to try to clarify the question a little bit. The question here is the diversification of life as a datum, and the question is what's the best explanation of that? Against Dr. Bergsma, I would say that if this side claims that the best explanation for the diversification of life, the diverse species, is natural selection working on random mutations, that does not preclude belief in the existence of God. It does not preclude the position that there are other data that do require God's existence as the best explanation. Against Dr. Doroski, I'm going to talk on both houses. Against Dr. Doroski, I'm going to say that I think that if you said that, okay, well, we have natural selection, we've observed it, and that provides some explanation for some appearance of new species, or even macroevolution, that's not sufficient to say that this is a sufficient or adequate explanation. I think you need to go back, as Dr. Bergsma was saying, that part of the Darwinian view is that there's common descent. And I think part of the Darwinian, part of your view should be, or supposed to be, you're defending that view, that we may need God's existence to account for various data, such as the human soul, such as the existence of the universe. But I think
30 seconds.
That this position is supposed to be the idea that we don't need God's existence to account for the design or the diversification of the species. And so I would like to get focus on that question is, granted that we may need God's existence to account for various data, do we need God's existence to account precisely for the diversification of life forms?
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Chair will now recognize Mr. Yes. You're welcome to the floor for a 2-minute speech.
Okay, I would like to just express a few thoughts for consideration for everyone on the topic of evolution. One heresy that's condemned by the church is Pelagianism, which is to suggest that there are other parents besides Adam and Eve. So, for original sin to pass on, it doesn't work to suggest that there are other humans besides Adam and Eve as the origin of our species. So that's needs to be considered. Another important thing is that the definition of science and empiricism cannot be empirically verified. So in discussions on evolution, philosophical approaches, even theological, are just as valid as scientific and empirical arguments. And just a last minute comment, I guess to say, on the topics of adaptation, and we see examples like the megalodon, right? It was very large shark, but it still looked like a shark, in my opinion. It's just smaller now, I don't know. But yeah, just a few thoughts for everyone. So don't believe in Pelagianism, otherwise you're a heretic. So.
Thank you. Chair will now recognize another speech. Chair would like to recognize Ms.
Lanjua.
To the floor. You will have 2 minutes.
Good evening, everyone. I just want to say I've heard a lot of really bad science tonight, and it makes me very sad. So make sure you understand scientific thought and reasoning arguments before you make them. Sorry. Thank you. Hey, just coming as a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry here. I've had my degree for 3 years. Anyway, so I want to make 3 points. The first is this idea that we're debating whether Darwinian evolution is the best explanation, and maybe it's not the best, there are flaws, maybe it's not completely correct, but I would venture to say it is better than anything we have. May there be tweaks in the future, may there be things that incorporate, and I personally incorporate
divine intervention and God's providence in evolution. I believe in both of them together. While that's not part of the widely accepted Darwinian evolution currently, that doesn't mean that what is currently accepted or talked about as Darwinian evolution is not the best that we have. I think that if we reject it because it does not include God, and then so we just attest to creationism, we are losing so much knowledge that God has allowed us to gain through our study of His creation. Second point I would like to make is someone brought up the fact that, or the idea that evolution is based off of a materialistic mindset. And I think that, I don't know if that's necessarily bad when you're talking about materialism as in like literally what is in front of us. It's God's creation, it's good, and if we can find out truth about it by studying it, it's fine. Third, I believe it was Mr. Hahn who made the point about hearing losing beauty and the appreciation of it. However, there is, I'm going to paraphrase this quote by a scientist, I wish I knew who it was and the exact quote. The first sip of the sciences will make you an atheist, but drinking it all the way to the bottom, you will find yourself believing in God. Just in the whole realm of science and mathematics, if you think about music, music is very mathematical. And when we understand the mathematics and the science of music, we can create even more beautiful music. Thank you.
So we'll be taking only a few more lightning round speeches, then there will be 2-minute speeches from each of the presenters. So 4 concluding speeches. Then we'll be moving into the vote. Chair would like to recognize our illustrious advisor, Dr. Plato, to the floor.
Thank you. Illustrious doesn't necessarily imply I have a great argument, but I do have a couple points I wanted to bring up. To me, it seems like when I came here, I thought, yeah, what is the other explanation? If there's no other explanation, then the only explanation is standing for the best explanation. That requires that it's an explanation. I don't think it's an explanation at all, because it's supposed to be explaining universal common descent. I don't see the epigenetics, I don't see what we've specified as natural selection, random or non-random mutation, explaining universal common descent. If we can't explain universal common descent, then we have not explained how Darwinian evolution is the best explanation, not for some diversification of life, all diversification of life. If we haven't done that, then we haven't explained it all. And if we haven't explained it all, then how could it be the best explanation? It's not an explanation at all. So I think what's going on with evolution is we, as Wittgenstein says, we are captive to a picture. We think there's this sort of way of explaining things, and then we think by sort of picturing it that we've explained things. But if you actually look at the genetics, the mechanisms, the history, the fossil records, you actually look at the evidence in the scientific world, it does not add up to an explanation of universal common descent. And if we can now simulate a lot of the mathematics, a lot of the theories we can put in laws with incredible computer technology, and when we try to simulate evolution in computers, the results do not come out the way Darwin thought, the way we think that it would be if universal common descent is true. It doesn't happen. One place where the picture comes up, I remember when I was younger, this seemed so convincing to me, is homology.
30 seconds.
Homology, where you've got, we have 5 limbs, a whale's fin has 5 limbs, so they look similar. But there's counterexamples to homology. So just because things look similar doesn't mean there's any genetic relationship whatsoever. Let's say you have insects, fruit flies, wasps, they look exactly the same, they're homologous. The body shapes. There's absolutely no genetic connection between those. Right? Certain dogs and certain wolves, right? That live in different places, they look very similar, they're homologous, they do not have the same genetic patterns that created the forms. So they look similar, we've showed that they have different genetic explanations for their same form. So these are counter-examples, right? So not only do we have no evidence of universal common descent, we have counter-examples to the source of evidence that's put forward. So I think that we should think that it's not an explanation at all, and therefore it's definitely not the best explanation. Do I have another explanation? No, I don't, but I don't need one, right? Because that's not the notion.
Chair would like to recognize Mr. Harold to the floor for a 2-minute speech. This will be the final lightning round speech. I'm sorry if you didn't get chosen, but I use a process of random chance to choose. Mr. Harold, 2 minutes.
Thank you, sir. It's been a little quiet tonight, and
and I would like to wrap things up a little bit. And the way I propose to do that is by arguing that there's actually evidence for evolution in the room tonight. And so let's begin with microevolution. I'd like to propose that in the microevolution of beards, we can see a progression. So we have at the lower levels Dr. Plato's beard. Then as we move to the higher echelons of beardedness, we have our illustrious chairman, Mr. Denigan. Then finally, when we arrive at the full heights of beardedness, we have, of course, Father Jonathan. Now that's microevolution, and then I was asking myself, okay, is there an example in the room of macroevolution? And I thought, well, the British, of course. Now you can really take that one either way, and we'll leave that open to interpretation. Okay, but I did have a serious point here, and this being the last slide in my speech, let me make that. The serious point is this. It seems to me that a lot of what this debate comes down to tonight is a question of authority. Because I can guarantee that many of you in the room tonight are in the same position that I'm in, which is that on this issue, I'm a layperson. I've researched it to some extent, but I don't know a lot about it. I'm not an expert. And so a lot of the question comes down to, who am I going to believe? And it seems to me that the problem that the opposing side has tonight is they have to be able to give an explanation for why the vast majority of the scientific community, including the vast majority of scientists at Franciscan, hold to evolutionary theory. Because the truth is, there's been good arguments made on both sides tonight. There's been good scientific arguments made on both sides. I don't know who's correct. I don't know who to believe. But unless the opposing side can explain to me why I should believe them, as opposed to the vast majority of the scientific community, including the vast majority of Catholic and Christian scientists, unless they can prove that to me, tonight I am going to feel forced to vote to oppose the motion. And that's what I have. Thank you very much.
God save the Queen.
We will now be moving to concluding speeches. I'd like to recognize the first concluding speech. Mr. Neal will be okay to do Dave. You will have 2 minutes for a speech, concluding speeches. After will follow Mr. DePra, and then Dr. Doroski, and Dr. Bergsma. What would you like? 30 seconds? We'll go at 30 seconds. Thank you.
Hello again. I just wanted to thank everyone as someone who's like really scared to talk in front of a lot of people having to do with something that is like very controversial. You talk to everyone who talks. Alright, cool. I wanted to bring up one more thing. It's called the theory of, I believe, irreducible complexity. So what evolution and a lot of sciences goes off of is that, so I'm a very complex human being. I am complex because I have a lot of proteins. And those proteins are complex because they're made of a lot of atoms. Go down, keep going, keep going, keep going, all the way to quarks and stuff. You keep having this complexity, and eventually you'll have to get to something. Also, like, even if you talk to a scientist, like, they're gonna have to get to a complex thing at the bottom. As a Catholic, I believe that complex thing at the bottom is in fact God. And so I just wanted to affirm that you can believe in this like evolution, this science, as well as creationism with God and Genesis and all of that. Again, I just want to point out it's Darwinian evolution. There's been a lot of talk about what does that entail. Does it have random mutation, non-random mutation? I was never told that this was going to be about, can't remember the words now, universal common descent. If you wanted some information on universal common descent, I can give it to you afterwards if you want. But as Dr. Doroski and some other people in the science and the affirming side have been saying, Darwinian evolution in the definition does not have universal common descent. It has, not that, I'm sorry, not the best public speaker. Thank you for your time.
I would now like to recognize Mr. DePra for a 2-minute speech. Thank you very much.
First of all, I want to thank you everyone so much. This has been incredible. And I just want to make express a few thoughts. The first one is that if evolutionism is just natural selection, then it's not a very insightful idea. And we cannot say that Darwin came up with it, right? We all know stronger species survive and lesser species don't. And stronger species have a higher reproduction rate and a greater chance of surviving. Less strong species have a diminished chance. But what the great assertion of Darwin is that he could explain diversification through simple life forms and ultimately one single-celled organism. This is the great statement. If it's just change, we don't need Darwin to see that animals change. We don't need Darwin to see that natural selection works. This is not what is being contended here. The second thing is, I'm sad Dr. McNamara left, but he was talking about how, McKenna. He was talking about how fitness cost was not required in reply, when he was replying to my Douglas Axe argument. But Douglas Axe actually wrote two papers. In the 2001 paper, he was trying to invalidate how one gene originates from another. And it is true, the impossibility relies in the lack of fitness cost because you destroy a gene. But in his 2003 paper, he acknowledges the factor of a duplicated gene upon which natural selection can operate and not have any fitness disadvantage, and yet it is statistically impossible for a protein to form. And this is a central question, right? Can we get new proteins? Can we get more complex features and structures through this mechanism? Because if we explain change through pre-existing things, we did not explain the origin of the diversification. We just explained how things change in the present. And all creationists accept... Please conclude. And I'm finished. Just remember the central contention of evolutionism. And if that stands up with what I said. Thank you.
Sure, now I'd like to recognize Dr. Doroski for a 2-minute speech. Thank you.
So, I think a lot of you already know this, but if you look at me, all right, you might notice that there's some usual things, all right? I actually am part German, Polish, and part Filipino, so I'm German-Filipino. So, what you have to do that is you have to mix a lot of different things and have them work together, all right? And this is what I try to do in my life all the time. I try to look at what's the truth in everything that I see, affirm that, and then not affirm only the things that are wrong. All right. So when I'm looking at this, okay, I'm looking at Darwinian evolution. I'm looking at, okay, what's the dictionary definition of this? What's the definition in the textbooks? Now, maybe Richard Dawkins said that you have to have common descent, but I'm not going to let an atheist define for me what Darwinian evolution is. All right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stand with JP2 and Pope Benedict when they say that these things are not in conflict with that. All right. If you want to stand against them, well, then you're on a different side. And we have a prudential disagreement, I suppose. All right. The other thing, so I do think, I will say too, I want to encourage us to keep on thinking about this deeply to increase our understanding of the faith, just like Pope Benedict tells us to. And I think maybe we should even have a different debate on, can evolution cause an increase in complexity? Or can evolution, or is evolution and an intelligence compatible? Or do you need an intelligence in this process? Because I think those are different questions. Those are not the questions that are part of the definition of this debate. I'll also say, so those are the types of things I focused on. I want to note one more thing. So there are lots of other evidences I could give for natural selection, but I kind of want to stick on these fundamentals, and I want to come back to Aristotle. So let's say we've got that statue of J.P. Cool out there. Let's say, what caused that? Was it somebody chiseling it, or was it because Franciscan wanted a statue of a saint? And we say, no, it's someone chiseled it, I saw it. No, it's because Franciscan wanted a statue of a saint, I saw the documents. No, one of those is formal cause, one of those is efficient cause. We had both of those, and that's what we have. And that's fine to have. All right, so you don't choose God or this, you choose both also. That's it. I was going to say one more thing. So also nothing.
Thank you very much. Sir, now I'd like to recognize Dr. Bergsma for a 2-minute speech. This will be the last speech of the night. We'll be moving into the vote after.
Yes, so this has been a wonderful evening, and thank you all for your participation, my colleagues, esteemed colleagues, and so on. This is Darwinian evolution, and I'd like to affirm what my co-belligerent Amadeo said, that one of the contributions that Darwin made to the theory of development was the idea that everything comes from a common ancestor. It's been pointed out several times tonight that we all share this DNA, so this DNA is an indication of common descent. Actually, that's not quite true. There are dozens of variation on DNA in different organisms. And these variations on DNA are frequently mutually fatal. For example, the coding for the stop codon is different in different forms of DNA. So if one organism tried to operate by the DNA of certain other kinds of organisms, and misinterpret that stop codon, that would be like not recognizing the period in a sentence or the end of an instruction line in a computer code, and there would be a frame misshift, and it would be fatal to the organism. This is admitted by Richard Dawkins himself. He says, you can see that there's no way that you could change the code once the code is established. But Dawkins, unfortunately, doesn't seem to be aware that there are dozens of variations on DNA. So the variations on DNA, which are mutually fatal,
30 seconds,
is a very strong argument against common ancestry, as is the fact that there are dozens of different kinds of groups of organisms whose fundamental cellular structure is different. It used to be that scientists organized organisms just by observable features, visible morphology. Now that's been replaced by looking at cellular structure, because it's been sensed that the structure of the cell is the most fundamental nature about groups of living things. And we have dozens of different fundamental cell structure, and it's very difficult to explain how that all could have come from one single cell.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bergsma. I'd like a round of applause for our presenters for tonight for their fantastic speeches. It's been a wonderful debate. I hope you enjoyed. We will be back in 2 weeks with the next debate. This will be a charity debate, so this is supposed to be more of a fun debate. We did this last year, raised $800 for charity, and it was on the question of dating at Franciscan. It will be a more fun debate. This debate will be on households. We're very excited. It should raise a good amount of money for charity. Also, I'd like to invite all of you to Dr. Peter Craft will be coming on this coming Friday to come here and talk. We are co-sponsoring the event with the Friday Academic Lecture Series. That'll be at 3 o'clock on that Friday, so I'll invite you to attend. As you're leaving, you will, hot off the press, receive the gauntlet for this week. So make sure to pick that up. They are also doing door delivery, so if you're interested in that, you can get it delivered to your door. Likewise, if you'd like to be more a part of the Veritas Society and what we do, Justine is in the back with the associates. The associates are supporters of the club in a more official role, particular benefits. So we're especially looking for freshmen and sophomore associates. Benefits such as meeting privately with Peter Crave and certain seminars, so it's a real benefit. And with that, so the charity debate, the charity debate will be in 2 weeks. Peter Crave will be coming on Friday. And once again, I'd like to thank everyone for a wonderful debate. With that, we will move into the vote. If you will be voting, please stand in your place with your right hand raised so that we can count you. The motion. This House believes that Darwinian evolution is the best explanation for the diversification of life on Earth. If you affirm the motion, please now stand with your right hand raised. The motion, this House believes that Darwinian evolution is the best explanation for the diversification of life on Earth. If you oppose the motion, please now stand with your right hand raised.
Yeah, this is going to be really close. Mr. Chair, look back. There's a tie. Cameraman, get tiebreaker. Just count. Just count.
And if you would like to abstain from voting on the motion, this House believes that Darwinian evolution is the best explanation for the diversification of life on Earth, please now stand.
Atta boy, Alex.
Your power just has been counted. The motion, this House believes that Darwinian evolution is the best explanation for the diversification of life on Earth. With a vote of 87 affirming, 68 opposing, and 27 abstaining, the motion has passed.